Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining me this Saturday afternoon. If someone would tell me if my audio is okay, that would be great if I have anybody watching. You know, these late summer Saturday afternoon live streams may or may not attract any people, but I do have some things that I want to talk about today as it relates to, let me bring the comments up here so when you comment I can have you on the screen, as it relates to camera news this week. So we're going to talk about some camera news that happened this week. We are going to talk first about what it is that I'm using to produce this live stream right now. And then we are going to talk about a subject that I almost made a standalone YouTube video on, and that is, what is your photography flex? And so we're gonna define that and talk about what that is. So first off, what am I shooting on today? So today I have the red Komodo-X, and that has the Canon 50mm RF-L lens on it. My audio is a little bit different today. So I've got the AEA KU5A. This is a hypercardioid or supercardioid ribbon microphone, which is kind of an odd thing and pretty cool. And I had been using this through the Rodecaster Pro 2, but I was having some issues with the Pro 2, and I've heard of a lot of issues with the Rodecaster Pro 2. In fairness, my unit that I'm using, this Rodecaster, seems to be working within spec. However, I have a couple friends who theirs stopped working within spec, and the sound pads would start shorting out. They got the runaround from Rode, and the rest is history. They don't want to support or be around Rode anymore. My Rodecaster Pro 2 has always seemed to work within spec. However, I have a setup right now where I am running audio from this microphone through a preamp, and then just into the camera to the Komodo-X for live streaming. I was having trouble with the Rodecaster. The Rodecaster Pro 2, the mixing console, it does a lot of nice things. It has a lot of great processing and such on board. However, it's not particularly well suited for taking a line level analog signal out of the back of the board and then gain staging it through other pieces of gear or sending it to an external recorder, so on and so forth. The hardware is pretty much designed just to hook up to a computer, right, and be used as a capture device / sound card, analog to digital, converter into a computer. So I was having trouble gain staging that into the Komodo-X and giving it the line level that it wanted to see, and I was getting distortion and stuff like that. So I went and picked up, and let me share my screen here. I went and picked up a DBX 286S. Now, these things have been around for a long time, the DVX 286s. And they are on sale right now at B&H. I'm not affiliated with B&H, nor am I getting anything from this. It's just something, this is what I'm using today, is I'm putting the KU5A through the DVX 286. Now, this is a pretty interesting piece of gear. Let me see, how can I make this move here? I think if I do this. So it has several different units in one, right? So it has the preamp section all the way over to the left, and that's pretty simple. You set the gain, and then to the right of that is going to be the compressor section. Now, the compressor section is a little bit different than what I'm used to, and it's a little bit different than most compressors. And so the two knobs on there are drive and density. I have no idea what those terms mean as far as audio goes, right? Because compressors I'm used to, attack, release, threshold, ratio, makeup gain. Like, I mean, I'm used to, with those settings. Drive and density, I have no idea what they do. But, I'm kind of playing around with it. Right to the right of that is the de-esser, and that is pretty self-explanatory. I don't use a de-esser. My voice has the opposite problem, is in that it's kind of muddy and mushy down low. I don't need anything to de-articulate it. I need something to articulate it. You have the enhancer beside that. Now, I have the high-frequency detail knob of the enhancer right now turned up to 5 because I want to get it crispy, and I think it's probably going to be maybe overly crispy because of that. This is my first time playing with this, by the way. Then the expander and the gate. So for those of you who don't know the difference between an expander and a gate, because the two terms are, let me minimize this here and go back to my screen so I can see if any comments come in. Okay, so the difference between an expander and a gate. There we go. They're both doing the same thing. So it's kind of like a backwards compressor, right? So whereas a compressor is taking the highest level of the peaks and limiting them down, the gate is taking the low threshold. So for instance, like, I want to be able to gate out and say, only above this threshold do you allow the audio to come up. And so if I'm doing breathing and I go, so I'm looking at my gate right now, I don't think those breaths came through. If I made them louder, now you could probably hear that, right? Because I have a gate that's gating everything below a certain threshold, to not hear. And so that's really good for live streaming like this. And so the expander gate is right next to it. And what's next to that? I think just the output so anyway, difference between an expander and a gate is a hard on and off. An expander attenuates things below the gate by a certain amount of dB as you are defining on the controls. So that's the difference between the expander and the gate. So the DVX unit, the 286, for $100 off at B&H, it's $189 now on sale. And the problem that I was having with the Rode Procaster 2 Pro Rode, whatever it is it wasn't giving a very hot line level signal out. And so on any of my cameras, actually, I was using on the Komodo-X, the C200s were a little bit better with this. None of the mirrorless cameras I could really use dongled analog to the Pro 2 because it's just not set up for that. And then the software that I'm using to stream is EVMux, and somehow, if I were to have the Rode Procaster as a sound card going into my computer, which is what it's designed to do, the EVMux software would then be responsible for putting the audio and the video together and timing it. And while the timing was good, I would always have artifacts, kind of robotic sounding artifacts. And I'm sure that's the software doing that. And I found that it is better to put audio into the camera that I'm shooting on and then have the camera come over. And so the DVX unit is better for that than the Procaster was. I don't have an EQ on the DVX unit, and so we'll see how it sounds. Maybe you guys can tell me how it sounds. So let's go ahead and move on now to the camera news. And let me see if I can, let me remove that. I'm gonna stop screen sharing. I will screen share again and go to the Nikon ZF, whatever it is, images. Okay, so the Nikon ZF, let me get over to this here. This isn't the most elegant interface, the way that this screen shares. So the chatter over the past week, it's been a pretty slow week. It's been a couple pretty slow weeks, actually, with camera news. So the chatter is this vintage-looking Nikon camera. And there also has been some chatter recently, like I think Andrea at Sony Alpha Rumors is talking about the A7C and the A7CR. So the vintagey kind of things are looking to kind of be hot tickets coming out. And this looks like a very interesting camera. I don't think anybody knows anything about it. They do not think it is going to have the stacked sensor of the Z9 and of the Z8 cameras, nor do I think that would be beneficial for them to do that, because those are class-leading cameras for that. But Nikon's biggest problem, see, that's not the problem with these Nikon cameras. The biggest problem with these Nikon cameras is that Nikon has decided a while ago to go away from using a mechanical shutter. And while there are disciplines of photography that may work for, like people shooting sports and wildlife, more wildlife than sports, anybody who uses lights as part of their photography workflow is automatically going to miss the mechanical shutter if they're using lights. And the best way I can explain this is, even with stacked sensors, okay, like for instance, I have a Canon R3, it's a stacked sensor. I have had a Sony Alpha 1, it's a stacked sensor. The A1 sensor, even though it's twice the resolution, more than twice the resolution of the R3, is faster. It's got a faster read speed on the A1 sensor. It's got a faster read speed on the A1 sensor, and it has a faster mechanical shutter on the A1, enabling you to take 1/400th of a second maximum flash sync shots with the A1's mechanical shutter, whereas the R3 only goes up to 1/250th of a second. And that's something that, let me see, remove this. And that's something that most cameras have flash syncs up to about 1/200th, 1/250th or so. So even stacked ones like the R3 has a maximum 1/250th of a second flash sync shot. Now, I can use that effectively to control ambient light. So, well, let me get into why would that matter to you? Okay, so it matters to you for the strength of your lights. And so when I'm out there shooting interiors and I have an AD200, a Godox AD200 Pro, I think it is, the one that I use most often. I'm going and doing flash ambient composites. I'm doing flash pops here and there. If I have a particularly large room, my 200 watt second light is not sometimes going to be adequate enough to light that entire room. And so what will I do in that case? I will increase the ISO value of my camera. So it makes my sensor more sensitive and therefore makes my light brighter. Now, if I am to increase the ISO value of my camera, the same thing that's making my light brighter in the room is also going to make my windows brighter, right? So I've got the sunlight outside, window light coming in. You can control that ambient light with a high shutter speed. Now, a strobe, a flash, cycles much faster than whatever shutter speed, so it's not going to affect the power of that strobe. And so that's where the maximum flash sync comes in. So the Sony Alpha 1 has a 1/400th of a second maximum mechanical flash sync. So I can go up, say, to ISO 800, right, which will make my strobe, my little 200 watt 8200, a lot more powerful than it is at 100. It'll make it a, what is that, 2 or 3 stops more powerful than it is down at 100. And then I can go all the way up to 1/400th of a second on the flash sync to control that nuclear window light coming in, which enables me to balance my flash exposure with the window light, give me some nice clean windows to work with. If you take a look at my latest recorded YouTube video, it just shows me going through a house doing exactly that, right? I'm putting my ISO value up, making my light more powerful, controlling the window light coming into the window. That is with the R3, and so it is still at that 1/250th maximum flash sync. But the Alpha 1, you know, and I'll say this, and it's, even though I don't have the camera anymore, I used it for a couple of years, and it is still the most mind-bending camera that has ever existed. The Sony Alpha 1 is. True statement. And that's just one of the reasons why, right, is this 1/400th flash sync. That has to do with the scan speed of that 50 megapixel stacked sensor, and it also has to do with the speed of its mechanical shutter. And so going back to the Nikon ZF that we have here, okay, and Nikon cameras in general, this is something that Nikon really should rethink. Their reluctance to have a mechanical shutter in a camera. And like I said, while that could be advantageous, well, I don't even know if I should say advantageous, while that could not be problematic for certain disciplines of photography like wildlife and maybe some sports and things like that, to have an electronic shutter only, it's going to be problematic with anybody who works with lights because of the flash sync thing. Now, you're going to have to make sensors that read a whole lot faster than what current sensors do in order to get around that particular problem. So let's see. Got Rocky, how you doing, bud? Comment for the algorithm. Well, thank you. And if whoever here, if you could like the video, that would be great too. See, I never know who I'm talking to with these Saturday afternoon live streams. I think most people Saturday afternoons aren't going to be hanging around watching a camera dude live stream. And so you guys let me know. I mean, do you think I could see, I've had these and they're kind of hit or miss. Sometimes they'll be good and I'll have a room full of people and there'll be a lot of good engagement and comments going on and such. And then other times it'll be like this, where I've got 2 currently watching. One of them's probably Rocky, and I appreciate you being here, Rocky. So you let me know if this would maybe be better for me to do this. So the 2 times that I have that's most available for me to do these live streams, if I'm going to do it weekly, and I want to try to do that, is weekend days, like right now, or then late at night. So I'm on the Pacific coast, and so Pacific Standard Time, after like 9 p.m., 10 p.m., when my kids, I have young kids, are in bed, that would work pretty well too. So let me know, you know, what would be good for that. So the Nikon ZF. Oh, let's talk about too the A7C and the A7CR. So the Sony cameras that are coming out. So let me pull up. Let me see if I can find real quick here. Sony A7CR. Because that is certainly going to be the more interesting one of these. Let's see, Tech Radar, A7C2, A7CR. Okay, so let's go back here, and we're going to stop sharing. We are going to start sharing this. And then we will pull it up on the screen. This really isn't a great way to do this, but okay. So the A7C2 and the A7CR. So let me just say this straight up, right? The Sony A7 IV, and if the A7C2 is essentially the A7 IV, as was the A7C version 1 was the A7 III, that's not a bad thing. And it's not a bad thing, especially if the only thing that I really have against the A7 IV, and I owned one for a while that I used side by side as kind of a backup camera to the A1. The only thing the A7 IV does really poorly, in my estimation, is it does not have a good feel in the hand. It feels cheap. In fact, I think the A7 III, which also felt lighter and cheaper than the A7R bodies, for instance, of the day, the A7R3, A7R4, I had those two. The A7 III felt a little lighter and cheaper in those, but not so much so as the A7 IV feels lighter and cheaper than the A7R5 than the Alpha 1. It's cheap feeling. And so if the A7C2 has the guts of the A7 IV, just doesn't have as powerful of an EVF, but has, let's say, a similar screen. If it has one card slot, okay, I mean, that's probably not for me, but that's okay. If that card slot has the CFX Type A card architecture on board it, that could be pretty awesome and worthwhile. I think that A7C2 has a lot going for it, you know, just like the first A7C did versus the A7 III. I think the big difference there was it had the articulating, you know, the flippy screen, whereas the A7 III just had the tilt screen. And so if the A7C2 is an A7 IV, basically in a more compact form, but if they can get that build quality up a little bit from the A7 IV, because the A7 IV really does feel cheap, you know, and if you have had, like I have, an A7 IV and an A1, you know, as part of the same loadout. The A1 was my main camera, and then the A7 IV was a backup camera to the A1. Handling them side by side, I mean, it is a big difference, right? It's the A1 is just this tank, and then the A7 IV is really cheap. So if they can make that a little bit less cheap feeling, the A7C2, then that would be great. And if they can knock a couple $100 off it, because it will be perhaps a little bit less fully featured than, say, the A7 IV is, you know, with the one card slot and such, I think that could be a fantastic camera for a lot of people. Really nice form factor. So especially with some of these Sony lenses that are very small. Sony has a lot of small, fast still lenses. The 35mm 1.8, that's a great lens. It's a great video lens too. A lot of people use it for video. Some of the GMs, like the 24 GM, is a pretty small lens and a light lens. You know, the older 55mm 1.8 Sony Zeiss, fantastic lens. It's one of the oldest lenses on the E-mount system, and it's still so good. And I think it gets overlooked for all of the newer, shinier, the 50 GM 1.2, the 1.4, you know, like all these other ones. But it's a great lens. And on a camera with the form factor of like an A7C2, that would be such an awesome lens, right? So beyond the A7C2, okay, there's also the A7CR, I think they call it. And this is a strange one because Sony, more than any other company, reuses sensors, right? So my buddy Josh and I were talking about this the other day, where more than any other company, Sony, and we were trying to count how many cameras the A7S III sensor has been in, and it's a lot, right? So it's the A7S III was the first one. Then came the FX3. Or maybe the FX6 came next, but the FX3 and the FX6 both have an A7S III sensor in it. And then what happened was, and this kind of rubs me the wrong way, and I had a video about it a while back too, is Sony had a big problem with the FX6 backorder for, like, I mean, there were people waiting. I heard one said he was waiting 18 months for an FX6 that he bought pretty early on after it was released, and Sony just couldn't produce it. I mean, this is during like the chip shortage and the world shutdown and all that too, right? So in fairness, it was during that period of time. But 18 months, right? Now, instead of filling those back orders, what Sony did toward the end of that period was release a PTZ camera that is essentially an FX6 on a motorized gimbal, or on a motorized pan tilt rather, head, right? And that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And it's not just because the backlog was that far back on the FX6s, but it's because you need to keep in mind who the FX6 customer is, right? The FX6 core customer is a working professional photographer. That's who is buying FX6s. Now, I'm not saying that people outside of that category don't buy FX6s. I'm sure they do, but this is a workhorse camera. I mean, this is like the new FS7 kind of thing, right? That's what the FX6 is. These are guys who are shooting documentaries, they're shooting corporate gigs. I mean, this is the FX6 customer. And so a lot of times these customers, these FX6 customers, have contracts that need to be fulfilled. They had already made their deal somewhere, and now they have, periodic media that they need to create, or they have, they're under contract to produce specific things. And instead of filling that FX6 back order, Sony, after months and months and months and months of it being problematic, decides to release a PTZ camera with FX6 guts. And it's like, you know what? That's kind of shifty. Like, because I'm sure that there are a lot of internals. I mean, this is Sony we're talking about. This is the king of reusing sensors and stuff anyway. I'm sure there are a lot of those internals inside that PTZ camera that are the FX6 camera. So, moving on. After that was the ZV-E1, I want to say, so all these cameras, right? The A7S III, FX3, FX6, the ZV-E1, I think I'm missing one. All have that same A7S III sensor in them. So I am making a point with this. So my point with this, and Rocky, let me bring up your comment here before I get to my point. Keep it up. Usually watch the streams later like a pucka. You know what? Thank you for saying that. That's I've heard that at least one other time before. And so even if here on Saturday afternoon I'm talking to nobody, I'm just gonna go for it anyway. And thank you for watching them later. That's cool. The A7 R5 screen. Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't talk about that, huh? And white balance sensor. Needs to go in every $2,000 moving forward. Both of my A7 IV cages curbs the cheapness. Yeah, no, you know what? Those are some good points that you make. Because I agree with you. So I put cages on everything too. I put cages on my stills cameras and on my videos cameras. I put cages on my stills cameras mostly because I use stills cameras for shooting interiors, and I like to have bubble levels on the top of the camera. And so the one-piece cages, I have found, makes a more level surface for screwing in a 1/4-20 bubble level to than finding some flat surface on the top of the camera or relying on the internal level within the camera itself. And so that's why I have cages on stills cameras too. But I think you're right. I think the solid piece cage does do a lot to curb the cheapness in the A7 IV. There is still, though, something to be said about the A1 and A7 R5, which I had briefly. I had the A7 R5 for a couple weeks, and that's all it took for me to decide it probably isn't for me. And if you want, I can get into why that was. But it allegedly is the A7 IV body, but it just felt, but the A7 IV feels cheap, and the way the buttons are, and the A1 is, and I don't know if it's because I've had the A1 that I'm just kind of like jaded now, but the Canon cameras feel better too. The Canon cameras all feel better. The A1 feels better. The A7 IV just feels cheap. Now, I'm not throwing shade here because I will be the first person to tell you, I believe the A7 IV is perhaps the most well-rounded, attainable camera that has ever existed. The Canon R6 Mark II is pretty good too. I mean, those are the two ones right there. The A7 IV is really, really good. And I kind of all the cameras that I'd sold going from the Sony to the Canon recently, in the past like 6 months, I'd been shooting Sony for years. And so the past 6 months, 8 months or so, because I had been collecting RF lenses while shooting on Red Komodo, I wanted to go to one lens ecosystem, and so I started selling all my Sony gear. Even having the Alpha 1, which I did, I still kind of miss the A7 IV more than the A1. And it's hard to really articulate why, but the A7 IV, I mean, first off, the files that come out of the A7 IV, well, I maybe shouldn't say that. The raw images that come out of the A7 IV, as they are interpreted by the Adobe suite, so Lightroom, Photoshop, are punchier and more contrasty and more saturated already than the A1 images are. Beyond that, okay, there is a resolution difference between 50 megapixel and 33 megapixel between the A7 IV and A1. You can see it. But beyond that, the A7 IV images being more contrasty, more punchy, more saturated, which is true. It's also better in low light than the A1. Now, the A1 is not bad in low light. And this is where I think, you know, the two different sensors, they are two different sensors, right? So the A1's advantages are the files are really robust on the A1. And it's hard to articulate this too, unless you were to work with them, right? So when you're out and you're shooting something that's very dynamic, like real estate, you can push and pull more highlights, especially with the A1 files than you can with the A7 IV files, or certainly than any of the Canon files. The Canons just aren't as good at that as the Sonys are, especially in the highlights, right, where their Canons are really clippy. And I lose skies, which even with the R3, shooting the R3, I have to dope it more underexposed for those single shot exposures than I do any of the Sony bodies. And this is Canon's $6,000, whatever it is now, $5,500 camera, right? So they just, it just doesn't work as good as the Sonys do in that regard. It does other things better, you know, but it doesn't work as good as Sonys do there. So no, I agree with you, and I agree with you about the screen. And I think I made a short at some point about the A7R5 screen. It is a fantastic screen, because when those things, there's only a couple companies that started making those flip and articulate screens, and I think Panasonic might have been the first one that did it, with the S1H, I think, has one of those. Is there a Fuji? I think there might be a Fuji with one too, but other people have tried it. Other companies have tried it, but Sony's the one that made it rigid and thin at the same time. And the A7R5 screen is like every $2,000 camera needs to have that screen. The white balance sensor in the A7R5, I found that the A1 was actually a little bit better at reading white balance than the A7R5, but I didn't have the A7R5 that long. That is one of the things globally, though, that I like about the Alpha 1 more than any other camera, really, that I have had, is its consistency in reading white balance is better than any camera I've ever had. The R3 is pretty good, though. The R3 is definitely better than the R5 variant cameras. And it's better than the A7 IV, but that is one of those things, reading white balance accurately and not having, you know, a set of images that are around the circumference of, say, like the same house, like I'll go and shoot, be wildly different white balances, you know, or like one of them looks orange, the other one looks blue, kind of thing. You know, there are lots of cameras that are like that. But no, I agree with you. Same had the A1, sold it for two A7 IV. I missed the silent shooting and slightly larger APS-C files. Yeah, I never really used the APS-C modes in anything. Yeah, the A7 IV, man, it's really hard to beat that camera. It really is. And it's crazy to think that even the A1 with the capabilities that the A1 has, and those are far beyond any other camera that exists. I mean, that is just the case. I just made a good example of that with the 1/400th flash sync thing. You know, it's like there aren't any other cameras that do that. You know, it's a 50 megapixel sensor that can that has a 1/400th of a second flash sync. It's crazy. The next iteration of A1 is going to have, if it doesn't have focus breathing, the people are going to like burn down Sony corporate, you know. So and I don't know why that is, because it's obviously a stills camera, you know, but they are mad about that. That it doesn't have a focus breathing compensation in video and whatever else they're mad about, you know. It's just stuff that's weird, you know, because it's a stills camera. You know, you want that kind of stuff by a video camera. The A1 isn't an especially good video camera. It just isn't. You know, the back screen is crap because it only tilts, the crap back screen. First, you can't see it in sunlight. You can't see it with polarized sunglasses. Because it only tilts, if you put it on the gimbal motor blocks the thing. It bends 4K 60, right? It doesn't oversample in a 4K 60. It bends 4K 60. It's just not a great video camera. The A1 isn't. World's best stills camera, not a great video camera. But if the A1 Mark II, if it doesn't have the focus breathing thing, people are going to boycott Sony, right? But if the A1 Mark II is the current Alpha 1 with the screen from the A7R5, I can't think of much else I would want on that camera. I mean, that's how good it is. Right? What is it, like 3 years old now, 2 years old at least? That's how good it is. I can't think of what else it does wrong. Then the screen is an absolute anomaly on the A1 because it's so bad. You know, there are cameras that are way junior to the A1 with much better screens on them. Sony 800 was first one remember with the flip rotate. Oh, really? I didn't know that the Sony had ever done a flip rotate. I call it a Gumby screen, you know. So that probably, as more cameras have Gumby screens, that'll probably come out again in some of my live streams. The Gumby screen, you know, it does the flip and it does the you know, the tilt kind of thing. So I know I have clever nicknames for everything. I automatically add the white balance lock to the custom buttons on my Sonys. Definitely miss it on the Canon cameras. Canon, please add white balance lock to the next cameras. White balance lock. So do you mean you shoot like your first shot auto white balance or whatever, and then you can lock it in, so all your subsequent shots after that are that same white balance? It's kind of clever. Yeah. So the way that I do the Canon cameras that I have now is I have auto white balance. So when I'm doing like exteriors, I'll have auto white balance with the priority of white. Now, Canon's white balance and Canon's exposure. So when you have both of those things kind of on like auto settings, I have found that both, even though they're supposed to be evaluative of the whole frame, they still give more weight to the focus point. This is especially true with exposure, right? So you can say evaluative metering for exposure. And, you know, and you read the manual and stuff, you know, and it'll say, oh, it gives an evaluative of the whole scene. And then, you know, and then it has different modes beyond that evaluative where it will give more or less weight to the center or the focus point or like whatever. But even if you have it on evaluative, so the most average of average that you can get with the exposure metering, it still has such a big difference what your focus point is focusing on. And it's going to read exposure off of that. And I have a feeling that the white balance is working kind of the same way with the Canon cameras. I think it's not just an evaluative, show me an average of everything in this scene and then calculate white balance on that. I think that's how the Sonys are working. But like when I move around my focus point, I swear I can see the white balance moving. You know, I know I can see the exposure moving. And so it's hard to see if the white balance is moving over the exposure doing this, right? It's hard to discern those two things when you're out there working with it. But, you know, any of these things, any of these tools, man, it's like you just, they're really competitive. I mean, all these cameras these days from all these firms are really competitive. Everybody's making really good stuff out there. But, there are going to be shortcomings with everything too. The A1 is the camera that I have found with the fewest of those compromises. So the reason that I got out of Sony and into Canon, though, again, is I like the Canon lenses better. I like the lenses better. I like being able to use the same lenses on the Red cameras and on the Canon cameras, because I have Red cameras and Canon cameras. And being able to take one set of RF lenses to be able to use on Red and on Canon is really handy. But the Sonys they're just so much better at some things. They're better at highlight roll off. They're better, I think, at white balance. They have fewer cripples, right? They have fewer cripples, and especially the Sony mirrorless cameras while shooting video have fewer cripples than the Canon. So I have no idea why the Canon and this. Let me back up a second. Regardless of video, in stills, the Sony lets you use zebras as an exposure tool, and I love that. I love being able to define my zebras at like 95 IRE, 97, whatever it is that I'd usually have them at. And that way, when I see zebras on something, I know that I'm approaching the point of no return, even in stills mode, for that, right? Canon, you cannot do that. The only exposure tool that you have in stills mode in Canon cameras is a histogram. Now, the histogram, you can make it an RGB histogram, which is kind of helpful sometimes, so you can see which channel. I mean, is it my sky that's going to be blowing? Is it, something else that's going to be blowing? But it is such a less useful exposure tool than a set of zebras that you can. And I have no idea why Canon doesn't allow us to have zebras in stills mode, because they're in the camera. You can do it in video. Why can't it? They define it as a video tool, whereas I look at it just as a useful exposure tool. And so beyond that, okay, now when we're talking more about video shooting between the Sony and the Canon cameras, so the R5C, for instance, does not behave like this, because Canon has branded that as a video camera, and so they've given it all the robust video tools, and it really is nice, the video tools that are on the R5C. But the R3, okay, that I have, and the OG R5, which I have had one of too, they behave like this, where if you shoot video on, they just do just the wildest things. Like, it'll give you, again, only a histogram. I think the R6 Mark II actually has false color, which is handy. I don't know if it disappears when you hit record, because that's what I'm about to say. So with the Canon mirrorless cameras, you only have a histogram, and then when you hit record, your histogram just leaves. So, that's it. You have, your zebras, you have zebras too. I think your zebras everything leaves, right, when you hit record. I think your zebras leave too. But one of the other strange things about Canon mirrorless camera shooting video is you cannot use focus peaking and zebras at the same time, even though one of them is for exposure and one of them is for focus. It won't let you do it. And it'll say that you can't do it. It'll say, sorry, you can't do this. And so it's just like strange things like that. I mean, if this is the way that Canon protects their cinema line, like, I'm not a fan. If it's in the camera, let me use it in whichever mode I choose, right? Same thing with like the Sony putting S-Log3 and everything. And people say, oh, well, the 8-bit cameras, 8-bit cameras, okay, I got it. They shouldn't have had log curves in them. But, in every 10-bit camera, regardless of the dynamic range of the sensor, you can still have Sony's best log curve profile in that camera, whereas Canon will not put C-Log2 in a non-cinema camera. They won't. And I have the R6. The R6 has more dynamic range than the R5C, than the R5. It does. That camera could effectively use C-Log2. I've shot RAW with the R6, developed it as C-Log2, and it looks beautiful. You know, so why C-Log 2 is not in, or I'm sorry, the R3 is what I'm saying, the R3. I've shot R3, C-Log 2, it has more dynamic range. It's beautiful. Why C-Log 2 is not in the R3? It must just be because they're trying to protect their cinema line, because that sensor does have an amazing amount of dynamic range. You don't hear a lot about that, though. You know, you always hear different things about the R3, but the sensor it has especially up top, it looks really good compared to the R5 variant cameras. Yep, exactly. White balance lock to keep it locked in. That's what I thought you were talking about. Also have started leaning on the video mode for the R5C to see my white balance. Leaning on the video mode for the R5C to see my white balance. Click over to photo, lock that in. Do I have a gray card? Yes. Am I sometimes lazy? Yes. So let me think about what you just said. So you have an R5C. Can you not see your white balance in the R5C in stills mode? I've never looked for it. But from what you say, that kind of suggests that maybe you can't see what your white balance value is in the R5C in stills mode, but in video mode, it's there on the screen. Can you see it in Sony cameras in stills mode? I don't know that either. That's very interesting, though, those points that you bring up. So, all right, so I was going to talk about your photography flex as well, but I've been going for about 50 minutes now, and I have a finite amount of time before my family and children get back in here. So I'm going to save that to next time. I'm gonna think about maybe doing a like a midweek live stream late at night and see if that is going to attract any more people than this one does. It's funny too, because like I said, it's really hit or miss. I did one, it was a couple weeks ago during the middle of the weekend, and had a bunch of people and great conversation and stuff. So Rocky, it was nice hanging out with you. It was nice hanging out with the 4 of you that are currently watching. If you have any questions, comments, leave them below. Tell me what you think about how my audio sounds. And so, you know, for those of you just coming in that didn't see my first spiel about my setup, I'm not using the Rodecaster Pro 2 anymore. I was having trouble kind of just gain staging that to the camera to live stream versus using it as a capture card and vice versa, technical stuff. So I am using a DBX 286S, which is a pretty old school analog channel strip with compressor, gate, really useful stuff on it, actually. And I have a little bit easier of a time gate staging that to the Komodo-X, which I'm shooting on. I've got the Breakout XLR box on the Komodo-X, defining that as a line input going line output of the 286S from my AEA KU5A ribbon microphone here. Let me know how it sounds. And I will see you guys next time. Thanks for hanging out.